Last week, the changes to Part 5 of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulation went into effect. These updates address emergency response planning for hazardous substances. The changes are intended to improve workplace safety by broadening and strengthening existing requirements. And the requirement is that they be reviewed, updated, and implemented in consultation with workers. But we've heard a lot of confusion around the changes. So today, WorkSafeBC joins us to help answer your questions and provide us all with clarity on what's now required of employers. Before we begin, we'd like to thank WorkSafeBC's for supporting and helping us make the webinars accessible to everyone. Joining me today are Tammy Durr, Industry and Program Specialist from WorkSafeBC, and Heidi Hare, Senior Safety Advisor here at the Alliance. Tammy will walk us through the changes to the regulations, share guidance on how to implement them, and then Heidi will take a few minutes to explain how the Alliance can help you. During the session, if you have any questions, please share them using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, Tammy. Thank you for joining us today. And of course, welcome, Heidi. I will leave it with you, ladies.
Hi, Tammy. Sorry to interrupt, but your audio isn't working.
Of course it's not.
Thank you.
There we go. Sorry about that. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. It's great to get a chance to actually talk to some of the employers and be in front of you guys. Thank you to the Manufacturing Safety Alliance for having me out and letting me speak for a minute or two to you. And Heidi, thank you for being my partner. For anybody that's in the Kelowna area, I'm going to be at the Manufacturing Safety Alliance conference. So if you want to stop by, I'll be up there. I'm going to jump right in. Heidi, did you want to say hello or?
No, I'll wait till the end. Thanks.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you today about the changes for Part 5, as we refer to them, because hazardous substances sticks on my tongue not so well. As I mentioned, if you have any questions or anything, please feel free. You're going to see me turning my head a fair bit because my monitor's over here. I apologize for that, but I'm getting old and the laptop monitor doesn't work so great for me. So today we're going to talk a bit about the background, some of the key changes, and it's not huge, resources that are available, and then of course any questions that you may have. So Part 5 has been around for a long time. It's not new, but they did come up with some changes and amendments, so we're going to talk about that. So this is what Part 5 currently requires, right? You need to adjust some emergency conditions. You need to have an inventory of hazardous substances. You need to have performed a risk assessment. You need to have an evacuation order. You need to have some safe work procedures in place, worker training, and drills. And chances are you do all of that already. That's going to be my guess. So I've laid out the regulations because I went to the great folks that write the guidelines and change the regulations. I was not part of this rewrite. I have been part of other rewrites, but not this particular one. And I said, so what's the difference? And as you can see, there really isn't huge changes. It's more about clarifying and renumbering the regulations. Now, sometimes when we renumber the regulations, it does get a little bit confusing, but the intent of these changes was actually to clarify already existing regulations. All right, let's talk about the key changes. So one of the questions I get asked all the time is, what's an example of an emergency situation, right? So we're talking about things that, spills, explosions, natural disasters, gas lines going. If you're near transportation lines, something like that going. Large things that are going to happen that are out of your control. All right. Is there any questions? Because there's quite a few questions out there. Please feel free to put them in the chat. Actually, sorry, I forgot I'm not taking them live. Okay, so hazardous substance is another popular question. So it is chemical, biological, physical agents. So the good way to start is with your WHMIS sheets, right? But if you're also a company that has pesticides or explosives, radioactive materials, consumer products. I did a big thing with retail. Consumer products are a little bit different because they do come under the Consumer Container Act. So they are designed to withstand quite a bit of impact. So there is actually some looking there. And as well, consumer impacts only in large quantities, right? Not small quantities. So if you've already established an emergency plan to deal with all of these, chances are everything that we're going to go through today, you've already done. And you may only need to add a column here or put some thought to a few things here and there. It shouldn't be a big deal. Okay, so what's a reasonable foreseeable emergency? It's kind of like what I was talking about. So you have an equipment failure, you have a spill. We had a hazardous substance spill a couple weeks ago at a chicken processing facility, and the spill was in the parking lot, and they have a shared parking lot. Right? So what are you going to do there? What's your plan? It can be a variety of things, but you just need to have a plan, right? What about a reasonably foreseeable upset condition? So you have, sorry, my mind's just taking a blank here. So you have like a emergency plant next to you, a process refinery plant. Sorry, my words are just missing for a second. You have a process refinery plant there. And, you know, you may want to take a look at that, right? Human error, you know, human organizational performance is a big thing. You have to expect that people are going to make mistakes. Cybersecurity is another one. What happens if somebody hacks your system? Or in the other thing that I've seen is, what if you lose your power? What if your apps don't work anymore, right? Same with the cooling, right? If you have any kind of refrigeration, ammonia systems, any of those kind of things, a loss of power can be a big impact to that. And any kind of storage, you know, anything that requires cooling. There's a lot of things out there that require environmentally sustained environments. And if they can't be done, what happens, right? So how are we going to deal with all this? Well, the first thing is we're going to talk to the workers, right? The workers always know everything. They really do. So have a chat with them. Find out what scares them, right? What are they concerned about? You also need to create an inventory of your hazardous substances. Now, chances are you've already done this, right? As I mentioned earlier, you have to have spill procedures. You have to have evacuation procedures. So there's a good chance that you have already got this in place. So what does that inventory look like? Like I say, you probably already have this. And you have to concentrate. The thing about this inventory is that it's only when you have an emergency, right? So you already have a risk inventory that in your day-to-day operations. So now you take that inventory and you think about it in case of a fire or an earthquake or a gas leak, or what if we have to have somebody, you know, what if our plan is not evacuation or our plan is evacuation, but really we need to stay in, right? You need to know what these hazardous substances will do as they change properties. It's really fun operating two systems over here. Okay, the structure of your inventory. So lots of you have more than one location, right? So the big thing about it is you need to make it so that it makes sense to you. And if you're transporting hazardous materials back and forth, what happens in the middle, right? Risk assessments, everybody's favorite thing. So the hope of all of this and the expectation is that you already have some form of risk assessment, that you don't need to redo it. General things when you want to consider doing a risk assessment is known and reasonable foreseeable causes of the emergency. I threw a few out there. You know, you need to take a look around your environment. Are you somewhere where wildfire is an issue? You know, that's a reasonable, foreseeable emergency. That was the one I was trying to pull off in my head, but it wasn't happening. Do you have hazardous properties around you? Potentially affected areas where a person may be at more risk than other areas? You know, conditions necessary to ensure safe handling and processes of the system. So for instance, that spill is one of them. They needed safe handling procedures with that. Methods for verifying and maintaining effectiveness of the control measures. That's part of the Plan, Do, Check, Act, right? Effectiveness of workers and others involved in the emergency response team. So make sure people know what they need to know and that the right person is equipped for the job. And that's part of your risk assessment, right? Okay, so obviously the objective, I'm pretty sure you guys all know this, is how likely is it and how large is the consequence? That's the first thing that any risk assessment tackles. Then, you know, how many people are involved, right? What's the maximum risk of the emergency? Is it going to happen? You know, they say we're going to have an earthquake, but I don't think we're going to have 10 in 1 month, you know, so you need to apply some common things like that, right? How likely is it to endanger somebody? You know, so is it an emergency that will happen in the corner of your plant and it's probably fairly well self-contained? Or is it something that's going to happen right in the middle where everybody's working? So here's some examples of risks that might be entering your workplace, because you have risks inside your workplace, but you also have risks outside of your workplace, right? So for instance, I mentioned if you're next door to a gas refinery, you might want to have a chat with them. Now, your neighbors don't have to have a talk with you, but it is nice if you work together, right? I also mentioned like the railways and the major roads. You know, what happens if there's an incident on the railway and it's a fire and you live in Crescent Beach Village where there's only one, or you work in Crescent Beach Village and there's only one in and out and it's got to cross that railway. As an employer, you need to consider, you know, what's going to happen to your workers and what is your due diligence in regards to them. What about flooding, earthquake, and forest fires? As I mentioned, you know, wildfires are a big deal in our province these days. Flooding is too. We had that massive flood out in the Fraser Valley. I don't think anybody anticipated that, but that would now be considered a reasonable, foreseeable emergency. Right, so these are some more things. Now, I want to point out that these regs were developed with large process in mind. Heavy process. So you go, okay, Tammy, I'm not heavy process. Now what? So we're trying to scale it down, right? If you are a large firm, we do have lots of different analysis tools that you can use. And actually, out of all of these, even for a medium to not super small, but small-ish, bow tie analysis are super, super positive. Again, when you're looking at your solutions, we're expecting that you have sound engineering practices. Now, those words don't appear in the regulations anywhere, actually, which is kind of interesting, but that's kind of the intent, right? And everybody has seen this control. So of course, anything that you develop in your emergency procedures should follow the hierarchy of safer design. Qualified person is another one that I get asked about. So Tammy, we have to do this risk assessment. Do I have to hire a hygiene officer? No, you do not. But you, sorry, you may have to speak to one. So a qualified person can be an individual or a group of people, right? So the actual person filling out the risk assessment, the scribe, does not need to be qualified, but you most likely need to speak to qualified people in order to be able to do the risk assessment and figure out the main 2 points, right? Any questions? If you have questions, please put that in there for me, because there's quite a few questions about that. So here's some things, you know, if the hazardous is of smaller quantities and it's not as big, the MSDS sheet or the WMIS sheet, sorry, showing my age, is fine to use, right? But you do want to consider input. It's all based on that risk. Here's my favorite picture. I put this in just because I think it's fun. So what, as I mentioned, you have to think about impacts from outside of your workplace. So I did this presentation not too long ago, and one of the employers was located on Burnaby Mountain, and they're a completely safe employer. Like, they primarily deal with water and very controlled, so it's not under pressure or anything like that. It's very, very safe environment. So he was kind of like, Tammy, I don't really have anything too much to write down. I'm like, that's great. However, you're on Burnaby Mountain. At the bottom of his street is a propane bulk tank. So they have a 12 block explosive limit around them. Behind him is the tank farm that sits on Burnaby Mountain. And at the bottom side of the other mountain is a large refinery. So there's three things right there that he should at least think about. He may not have to do anything about it, but you need to consider, what would the impact of that be? Emergency response plans, right? This is the thing about emergency response plans, is in the case of an emergency, most people are not going to run to the shelf and grab the binder where the emergency response plan sits. It needs to be inherently known by your organization, right? It needs to have a clear description of the emergency, as well as this is where the hazard risk inventory comes into play. Because if, building C is on fire and we need to know, nobody really knows what's in building C, somebody might need to pull out that risk assessment. So it needs to be someplace accessible, not where any emergencies would happen, and consider lack of power as well, right? So as I mentioned, you're going to include that risk assessment. Roles and responsibilities are a big thing, because when emergencies happen, people panic. Some people have training that you don't know about. Some people don't have any training, but they want to be helpful. So roles and responsibilities are very, very important, right? Who's in charge of the evacuation if it's an evacuation? Who's in charge of that decision? How is that decision going to get translated to the staff, right? How are people going to know what's what? I was in a workplace not that long ago, and they have a fire hose attached to the wall, and it's like a firefighter fire hose, that kind of fire. And I'm like, so what do you do with that? And he says, nothing. And I'm like, well, how come? And he said, well, because it's just a building requirement. It's actually not part of our emergency response plan. And so I suggested, that they make sure that the staff really, really know that, because in case of emergency, a big fire, somebody might run and try and make that work, right? So, that's super important. And that goes to who responds to the fire and the emergencies, or whatever the emergency is, and training and drilling that so that it just becomes muscle memory for people. Super important. Again, nobody's going to run to the shelf, pull the book off, start to read it. What do we do here? Right? So the other thing that you need to consider, and none of this is new, again, this is all stuff that you've had to think about in the past, is who do you notify? Right? Who are the people that you need to talk to? Who may be at serious injury risk, or, who is the most at risk? Those are the people you need to talk to first. And what about the people outside of your workplace? What if you have dispatched workers, or what if you have contractors working for you? It also has to include those folks, not just the people in the building. You may have to contact other emergencies. What if it's a gas line leak, right? There's no point in calling the RCMP first. They're not gonna be your responders. Your gas provider is. So, and depending where you are in the province, it could be someone other than Fortis or Hydro. Like, I did a project around high voltage, and I was quite surprised. There's about 20 power suppliers around the province. So know who that is ahead of time, right? Here's some examples of local agencies. Specifically if you're dealing with a volunteer fire situation, you want to know that those responders know what you have in your building, right? Do they have the right equipment to fight the fires? If you are an industry that has a lot of silos, that requires very precision firefighting skills, and it's not turn the hose on it, because that's going to make it even worse, right? Municipal agents, right? There's always those to the utility providers. And if your response plan is to contact hazmat, who's going to do that, right? You want to have that figured out ahead of time. So here's just a few provincial and federal agencies that you can think about, what would apply to your workplace, right? Most emergency response people, first responders, follow an incident command methodology, and they typically all use the same one. So it's a good idea in your workplace if you can match your incident command with your emergency responders. So if they have someone that's responsible for the gas line and someone that's responsible for emergency procedure, getting people out and notifying this and doing that, it's good to know their plan so you can match their plan up with it. So what do you have to include, right? You have to think about your location, the extent, how are you going to control it? What is your response? If it's a spill like those folks had a couple of weeks ago, how are you going to clean it up? Do you expect your workers to clean it up, or does your janitorial staff come involved, or do you hire a contractor, right? And if it is a hazardous substance, what do you do with it once you cleaned it up? Because now you've got, something that isn't useful and needs to be put away with. What if it's radioactive material? And how are you going to decide how everybody enters back into the building, right? Do you need to do some air monitoring? Do you need to get an engineer out? Of course, the first thing that jumps to my head, because I'm a safety person, is it depends. It depends on the type of emergencies, right? More thoughts about safe work procedures, quick action is going to be necessary, as I mentioned, like running to a shelf and reading the book is not the best time to learn your safe work procedures for this. And I mentioned the non-responding workers. So think about those people that are outside your workplace, but may be coming into them, right? What about your neighbors? Be a good neighbor, talk to them. Anybody that you can think of, even if you're, what if you're next to a park, right? You might want to call the city if you've got some kind of issue. I was in another workplace a couple of weeks ago and doing this presentation, and I looked out in the parking lot, and the muster station was on the edge of their property, but it was right next to their neighbor's building, right? So, like a parking, not even a full parking lot away. So I asked him, I said, well, do you know what your neighbor does? And he's like, no, not really. And I'm like, well, what happens? Is that really a good place to muster? So as I mentioned, as we all know, safe work procedures must be readily available. And again, think about that situation when you don't have power, you don't have access to your computers, you need to communicate with a lot of people, depending on the size of your organization. How are you going to do that? And then what about afterwards? How are you going to decide, as I mentioned, when it's good to go back in? Is it like we do fire drills at WorkSafe, so you hear two bells, first one, get ready, second one, you get out the door, then you hear an all clear, you go back in the building. Very simple procedure, right? What if it's an earthquake? I don't know, when do people know when they have to go back in? No idea, right? That's for you guys to figure out. Training and drills, super important. They must be conducted. Again, people pulling out that book, trying to read what you're supposed to do at that time, or having 25 to, thousands of people run in circles during an emergency, also not the best thing. You guys all know, you should all do this already. You've already planned for drills of various types. So as you can see, I don't read slides to you. These slides have a lot of words on them so that I can send them to you afterwards. But definitely drill the ones that are the biggest risk. Most companies have fire drills. What about a spill drill? What if something happens along that lines, right? The big thing too is, the plan, do, check, act stuff. What are you going to do? Who responds to what? Notice and communication, evacuation procedures, emergency response, knowledge and preparedness. Who's got that list of the hazards specific? Because I can tell you the fire department will want to know that. If they're running into a building full of, explosive materials, that's good for them to know. They might not be your best friends during it because they're a little bit busy, but definitely if there's something that's going to be of hazard to them, they need to know that. So again, this is the good plan, do, check, act. After you've run those drills, where's the deficiencies? What can we do, right? I worked for an employer once where they had us evacuate onto the top of a second story parking parkade. So I sort of pointed out to them, because I was a new little safety nerd, that might not be the best thing to do. So the muster stations got changed, maybe there's something that you need to do differently to check air quality or the condition of the building itself. Or maybe you need to get something from your neighbor that says it's all clear to go in because the emergency started with them and you had to evacuate. So, at the end of every good presentation is what you really need to know. And here it is, right? You are not expected to contemplate every possible emergency in the universe, right? It's the ones that are foreseeable, reasonable, foreseeable in your area. If you're nowhere near railroad tracks, you don't have to worry about trains. If you're nowhere near refineries, you probably don't need to think about things blowing up. But if you are near a forest or places that have, regular wildfires, you do need to think about stuff like that, right? You can group your hazardous substances together. So where you have a group of hazardous substances that are of the same properties, you're not expected to do each single one. You can do them in a group. The other thing is you're not really expected to create separate documents. The expectation is you already have an ECP, you have something along that lines that will, you can just add to, you just add the column, right? So focus on the hazardous materials and where they're stored in large quantities. If they're not stored in a large quantity, you probably don't need to worry about it as long as they're not highly toxic or flammable. I have to always quantify that because there are definitely some chemicals out there where it only needs a couple drops, and that is far too much. So being work safe, We have a bunch of information out there now for you. The guidelines are out there. I've gone through the guidelines. They're very well written. They give a lot of examples of, like I did, what's an emergency procedure, what's a qualified person, what's a hazardous substance. I pulled all the information on the guidelines. So I welcome you to read those, and I will pass these on to MSABC, this presentation, and they can do with it as they will. Questions? Look how fast I did that. I'm getting good at this. Heidi, over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Tammy. That was excellent. We will get to questions at the end, as Tammy has said. She's answered some of them. I was looking at the questions that were popping up in the chat window, and she has answered some of them, so that's good. So I'm just going to go through how the Manufacturing Safety Alliance can help you with these emergency response planning. We'll let you know what we've got available to you, and then discuss things going forward, and then we'll get into our Q&A session. So specialized services that are available to you. So we do have a very good team here at MSABC that includes 2 hygienists on staff, and our advisors are able to help you walk through your site and do the WHMIS inventory and hazardous substance inventory. So updating them, again, as Tammy had said, it could just be a matter of adding a couple of columns to an existing inventory and then determining where it's stored, how it's stored, and what's going to happen if it does go boom or does leak. We do have documents and templates available for emergency response and risk assessments, which will then feed into your emergency response plan. So we've now included a section in here in our risk assessment for the hazardous substances, and we do have a resource available to do the risk assessment for hazardous substances. We are also here to provide support to the Joint Health and Safety Committee or the Worker Safety Rep, as this is now a requirement under the change in regulations to include worker representation when you do these assessments. So we're here to help walk through the Joint Committee, through doing the risk assessments, doing the inventories, also having the discussion on drills, what type of drills are going to be available or should you have. We've got a lot of stuff coming out. We help support this for the changes for the first aid changes for the drills for that. So we can also help discuss, do we need emergency response and evacuation? Do we need spill cleanup? So we can help support joint committees on that as well. So what resources do we have going forward? So training and drills, again, we do have some online resources for training for emergency response awareness. We have all sorts of templates available to you for you to be able to fill in on your own or with our support. There's a list of them here, including a steps for compliance document, which takes the presentation that Tammy has provided, a little bit of a summary and steps for you to walk through as a joint committee, as an employer, as the worker rep to be able to comply with this, just sort of lays it out for you to be able to do that. And then our online tools, we've got toolbox talks available, safety topics for emergency response planning, so a lot of things. And as always, our team is always available here for you if you have any questions or need any help whatsoever. You can contact us. And now we'll open up the floor for the questions. And I thank you all for coming to this.
Great. Well, thank you, Tammy and Heidi, for your presentations. So yeah, so we just want to open up the floor for some questions. I see some here in the chat. So one of them is, did the regs remove table 5 with all the TLVs? I think you might be on mute. Oh, there you
Table
go.
5 is still there. The TLVs, they were updated actually not that long ago. I can't speak to the updates, but I did see the notice that the table had been updated. So definitely a good resource for figuring out your risk assessments.
Okay, great. Another one was there an incident that triggered the updates to the OHSR?
I don't think a specific one, no.
No?
Usually once a year or so, our executive level get together and they look at the risk for industries and they decide, where risks are based and where the issues are coming from, both based on orders and claims. So this was probably on the list.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. There was one more here. Oh, if the regulations can recommend ICS training, that will help a lot. ICS brings everything together.
Sorry, can you define ICS for me? So I'm making sure I understand it.
Well,
Incident command.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Sorry, what was the question then?
If the regulations can recommend incident command system, that will help a lot, as incident command system brings everything together.
I agreed. Incident command systems does bring everything together. We do not recommend one, or we don't have one. There's lots of resources. I'm sure the Safety Alliance can help you find some. The reason that we don't recommend things like that is because the classic safety answer, it depends. We might give you the wrong resource based on your location or your kind of workplace. So I think it's better if you work with the Safety Alliance to determine exactly the right information that you need, and then we can make sure you get that.
Okay. I'm just reading through here. Is there a sample of emergency response plan that covers multiple facilities, or should each facility have their own?
It depends. We left that up to you. So I would think you probably want a little bit of both. Like if I was an employer, I would want a little bit of both. So I would want to be able to, deal with the building itself. And then you probably need to look at a higher picture, right? So, and that would be from a business continuity perspective too. If building C goes out, what happens to the overall business process? Are we still able to do whatever it is we do safely, or does that put us, in a different kind of risk category? So.
Okay. Another one, if a company regulated by Transport Canada and Environment Canada already has emergency response action plans that are standalone documents and cover all these new requirements, how do you combine these new regulations with existing TDG and E2 regs? Because they appear to be the same and are being harmonized.
If you already have that information at hand via those other documents, you most likely have covered everything that you need in Part 5. That would be a good time, again, to, call in the Safety Alliance and just review it with them against the regulations. That's why I said at the beginning, too, that the expectation is this shouldn't be, a ton of work, because you've already done a ton of work to get to this position. So hopefully this is just a matter of, going through and maybe adding some comments or something along that lines.
Okay. Another question. Whoa, we're good for time here, Tammy. We've got lots of time for questions.
I talked fast.
You were zipping through it. So does this only apply to hazardous materials in large quantities? For example, if you have 500 spray paint bottles, would this qualify for having an emergency plan? And do you need to create an inventory of every single item that's hazardous, even if it is only in a small individual bottle?
Okay, great question. Again, I love saying it depends. So a few different things on that one. As I mentioned earlier, 4 drops of a highly explosive chemical is too much, but we would think, oh, it's only 4 drops. So that's where the risk assessment comes in. If it's super flammable and super dangerous, then yes, you need to deal with it. The quantity, again, that depends. If it's contained and stored in a capacity, and you figure out that in an emergency situation, because again, this is only in emergency situations, that skid of bleach that's on the floor in the back corner, probably not the worst thing you need to worry about, but you'd have to do your risk assessment to figure that out. So the quantity thing, it depends on what the material is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we had another question about the reg changes and why this is coming up. So do you have the numbers with respect to orders and claims that substantiated the change to the regs?
I do not. That's a great question. Oh, no, I don't. Man, that's a great question. I'm actually going to go back because I just want to know the answer to that. Like, how did the change for this come about? I'm assuming is the question.
Okay. Well, we had one of the attendees actually respond back about the instant command system. And they're just saying it's free online. So perhaps we will also look for some resource for that. If the attendees are interested, we can maybe put some links in. And then another question here, if the site is close to emergency service, or I guess this is a comment, it's better to focus on evacuation roll call and the rest will be handled by professionals. Otherwise, will the site need to have a reliable person to handle the E situation?
The E situation would the evacuation, the emergency situation. Well, it depends on what the emergency is. Like evacuation is the easy one, right? Everybody out, get as far away as you can. Bob's your uncle, right? Then have some sort of professional clear it before you come in. What happens if you have to evacuate in-house? Right? What if you have to stay there, right? What if you can't get out of the building? What if you're trapped? What if you have a 22-story building and the people on the 23rd story can't get down, or emergency responders can't get up? Think about things like that. That sort of, to me, that's a much trickier question to answer than, everybody get out the door. That's a little bit easier. Now, of course, the get out the door scenario is tough to make sure you got everybody out the door. Right. And I know at WorkSafe, we used to have a lot of different procedures for evacuation because we had different types of workers. We absolutely employ workers with different disabilities. And so the person that used to work beside me had something that may, trigger in an emergency. So my job was to go get the wheelchair and get her into the wheelchair and then get her to the area where all the wheelchair people get evacuated from. So, there's a lot of different things to think about, whether you have able bodies, multiple stories, several buildings. If you have 10 buildings and one person in charge, they better have a bunch of people helping them. you know, with a
Mhm.
very clear role and responsibility, because how do you know everybody in those 10 buildings are accounted for? And sort of the
Right.
trickier question that comes to my mind is, what are you doing with your dispatch workers? Like, how are you prevent, or your next shift? And if you don't have power, how are you preventing them from coming into the building or coming to the, you know, the scene, right? Because you really don't need a whole nother shift of workers showing up in the middle of a whatever, right?
Mhm.
I know that because I'm really old, I was at WorkSafe when we had an earthquake. I think it was around 2002, and we all got evacuated, and all, you know, us good moms and dads, the first things we did was pull out our cell phone and make sure our little children were safe, right? That was the very first thing I did. Well, guess what? My cell phone didn't work,
Mm.
right? So then
Yeah.
what? You know, what if you, okay, so now we have a citywide earthquake and you have dispatch workers all over the place.
Mhm.
What are you doing for them? You know, what's the answer? How, did they go home? Did they come back? Do they, you know, what do they do? Right? What if they can't use the roads? You know, like, it's the earthquake one can be quite mind-boggling, and don't get too
Right.
carried away with it. I'm the wife, mother, and daughter of firefighters, so my brain goes a little crazy sometimes. But
Okay.
um, you know, those are the types of things that you want to think about, right? The
Right.
evacuate one is pretty easy, you know.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, one of the questions that came in, is it possible to have one-on-one meetings? And yes, as part of MSABC, we do provide one-on-one consultative services. So please reach out to us if you are interested in meeting with one of our advisors. We can definitely help you, walk through your plan and help you put some of these things in place if you have more questions. Another comment that came from our attendees, when we talk about emergency response plan, it means the event happened and we are to protect and reduce the impact, not to prevent the event. So what is the role of the risk assessment that is relies on the likelihood of happening of an event? What is the role of the risk assessment? Oh, what role does the risk assessment, I guess, play on the likelihood of a potential event happening?
I I'd like to just speak briefly on this, just as
Mhm.
a when we look at our WMIS inventory, so we are required to have a full WMIS inventory. And one of the things that we're going to adjust on this is the fact we have to look at the physical properties of it. So what state it's in, where we're storing it, how we're storing it, and the quantities that we have. So if we come through and we start doing these risk assessments on the hazardous substances, we may find that we have products that are stored in incompatible situations, and we can correct that. We have products that are stored in large quantities that need to be changed and moved to we'll call it a quote unquote fireproof room, so to speak. So we've got a minimum wall to make sure that you've got a burn rate so that you've got 2 hours of burn rate in there. So then we start to look at the fire code. So when we do this risk assessment, it's going to give us the ability to look to see where we've got these chemicals stored and say, right now, if this was to explode or burn or leak, we have a problem. So
Right.
let's mitigate this and put it in a spill berm, put it in a cabinet, put it in a fire rated room, etc., so that we can look at that. So that is the proactive part of it to reduce it from if it does happen, we've reduced the risk associated with it because again, this is based on foreseeable risk and occurrences, but there are certain things that we can do to help lessen the severity if something happens, and the risk assessment is going to help us do that.
Absolutely. Good. Great answer. Very thorough. So another question, will WorkSafe be inspecting large manufacturers using dangerous goods substances to ensure they have implemented these new changes?
Well, we always inspect. There's no, you know, there's no call to go find out this.
Mhm.
If you're, you know, if you the lucky person that gets the inspection that day, they will be looking for this kind of thing for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And they would have been looking for this before, or possibly depending on what they find in your workplace, obviously it's a risk-based inspection. So it's, yeah.
Okay. Another question that just came through is a WMIS inventory separate from a MSDS book?
They align
Sorry.
with each other.
Yeah, I was
So
going to say, I don't
your
understand the question.
SDS, so your WMIS
Yeah.
inventory, part of that WMIS inventory is the requirement to have current SDSs within 3 years, and you have to have those available. So if you have an SDS book, that is possibly just a book that has all your SDSs in it, and you have a table of contents, and that's your WMIS inventory. But you need to have, I'm going to say that they are one and the same. So sometimes the WMIS inventory is an online, and then the SDS is a binder, or it's both. So,
Okay.
and I would suggest that you have something available, because that inventory, the WMIS and the hazardous substance, needs to be available with your fire plan. So the fire department needs to know what kind of chemicals you have in the building and where they're stored, etc. So I'm going to say they're one and the same.
For sure. All right. I think that will probably rounds off our time as far as questions, but if you do have further questions, please put them in the chat. We will follow up with you. As we mentioned, Heidi or Tammy will respond. Before I close off with some of the exciting other things that we have happening at MSABC for everyone, Tammy, Heidi, do you have anything else you'd like to, maybe share or let us know about that maybe a question prompted you going, hey, I forgot to mention that?
No, just come on
You're
by and
good?
see us at the booth in Kelowna. It'd be great to see the folks up there.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you to you both for a great presentation. Very informative. Yeah, and I think it definitely will help our attendees help them to understand better the changes that are required to be made. As I said, we'll share any questions left unanswered today with our guests and share the responses along with the recording and resources from today's webinar. So that will complete today's webinar. And for those that are interested, our next webinar is coming up Wednesday, February 26th at 11 a.m. STP Compliance EHS joins us to share a picture of the regulatory changes and trends we can expect in 2025. Information that may impact your health and safety plans as it further shapes the EHS landscape in Canada. Tomorrow is the last day for early bird savings for Make It Safe Vancouver Island in Nanaimo, March 13th. So we're excited about that. And this is a perfect time to save your seats for Make It Safe Okanagan in Kelowna on April 10th. By then, hopefully the weather is warmed up, so you should be able to enjoy our beautiful interior. Last year we sold out and it was standing room only, so get your tickets today. And again, we will have it in the chat, but for those that maybe aren't aware, it's for details, just visit makeitsafe.ca. Alongside those events in Nanaimo on March 14th, join us for a one-day 5S training and certificate class with a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt instructor. And in Kelowna, April 9th and 10th, save your seats for a 2-day dust hazard analysis course. That's exciting, isn't it? The combustible dust regulations will be changing in this next year, and many new industries will be impacted. If your production processes create dust, this is a hazard you need to pay attention to. So although it might be a bit dry, excused, it is critically important. We are also coming up to the deadline for nominations for the 2025 Safety Excellence Awards. If your colleague, executive leader, company, or joint health safety committee inspires you towards better health and safety, nominate them today. All right, last announcement. Until February 28th, save 20% when you book a 2025 private group training for your team. So that is a great value, and we have a lot of great instructors that can have a wide range of topics. And as always, visit us online anytime for help or to access our webinars and resources. Watch for an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of today's session. And if you don't mind, a survey link to share your feedback and topic ideas. We are always wanting to ensure that we are applicable and, meet what the questions and thoughts you have. As you leave today, please share again your thoughts with this survey. And thank you very much for attending. And we will see you guys all next week. Take care.